Chapter 1. Awakening. Adrian stood waist-deep in a river, the clear water rushing around his legs, the warm sun on his skin. A fishing pole rested in his hands, the line slack in the water. But the weight of the moment wasn't in the catch. It was in the laughter, the light. Free laughter of someone beside him. Though he couldn't make out their face, they stood close, almost touching, a figure of warmth and comfort. He could feel the joy of the moment, hear the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Who were they? A friend? An ally? Maybe something more? Their voice spoke softly, calling his name, but the words were lost in the river's current. Suddenly it all shattered. A sharp kick to his ribs yanked him out of the peaceful river and back into the harsh reality of his life. Adrian's eyes shot open, the tranquil scene replaced by the grime and the stench of his cell. His body instinctively curled inward as another boot connected with his side, pain flaring throughout his bruised torso. "Get up!" a voice barked. It was rough, impatient, with the kind of authority that had been beaten into him over the years of servitude. Adrian groaned, but no words came from his lips. He had long since stopped trying to speak back. The assaulter grabbed him roughly by the arm, yanking him to his feet before slamming him against the cold stone wall. Adrian barely had time to steady himself before another guard appeared, tossing a bucket of ice-cold water over him. It drenched him to the bone, the chill biting into his skin, but still, Adrian remained silent. He grunted as they kicked his legs again, for good measure, but even then his eyes remained cold and unyielding. "Get ready," one of them spat. "And don't you dare throw this one like you did last time." The guard's tone grew darker as he continued. "The organization's leader is here today, and they like to see a real fight. A truthful game of blood in the pits. If you fail to entertain them, well, you know what happens next." They didn't need to say more. Adrian had seen enough gladiators who had displeased their masters. They didn't last long. He knew the cost of disobedience, and yet something inside him had fought back during this last battle. A refusal to give them what they wanted. That had earned him another round of beatings, and a warning that still echoed in his mind. The guards left, the heavy door to his cell slamming shut behind him, leaving Adrian in silence. His chest heaved as he shook off the water, droplets mixing with the dry blood and grime caking his skin. His body was a tapestry of scars, each telling a story of battles fought and survived. His muscles, lean and hardened from years of combat, were bruised and aching from the constant abuse. The light from the small barred window barely illuminated the room, but Adrian didn't need that much light to know every inch of this place that he both called home and a prison. He moved to the corner of his cell, where his armor lay. One piece at a time, he prepared himself, methodically slipping into the only clothing he had ever known in his life, the attire of a gladiator. First, the greaves, the bronze medal worn and scarred from countless battle, strapped tightly over his legs. Then the vambraces, sliding it onto his forearms like old companions, the metal etched with the blows they had deflected. The breastplate came next, heavy and familiar, securing it over his chest. Though it did little to protect the wounds he already had there, each piece was a reminder of the blood he had spilled, and the blood yet still to be drawn. He caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of a small, grimy shard of a mirror. His face, angular and sharp, was as bruised as the rest of him. His crimson hair, still dripping from the bucket of water, clung to his neck and shoulders. His bright yellow and red eyes, once fierce and full of fire, now held a cold, focused intensity. He wasn't the boy who had once dreamed of rivers and freedom. He was now something else. A guard banged on the door, his voice carrying through the small crack. "Get ready, you're up." Adrian strapped his sword to his side and grabbed his spear, his hand gripping the familiar weapon tightly. This was his life now. He shut out the pain, the fear, the endless cycle of violence that awaited him. He moved towards the door as it opened, following the guards down the narrow corridor towards the arena. The sound of the crowd outside grew louder with each step, a thunderous roar that sent vibrations through the walls. Adrian's heartbeat remained steady, his breath calm, though his body ached with every movement. They led him to the portcullis, the iron gate still closed, separating him from the roaring sea of spectators and the blood-soaked sands of the arena. The familiar scent of dust, sweat, and death filled his nostrils. He stared at the gate as it began to rise, the blinding light of the arena flooding the small corridor. As he took a deep breath, Adrian's thoughts flickered briefly to the dream, the river, the laughter, the unknown figure. But it was gone as quickly as it came, washed by the cold reality of the situation. What am I fighting today? He thought as the gate clanked open, revealing the area beyond. The roar of the crowd greeted him as he stepped forward into the light, his mind sharpening with the promise of battle. Adrian stepped into the arena, the roar of the crowd crashing down on him like a tidal wave. But there was no hesitation in his steps, no fear in his gaze as he surveyed the field. 4 gladiators stood opposite of him, each one armed with a shield and a short sword. It didn't take long for Adrian to understand the situation. This wasn't just a battle, it was a public execution. Ah, of course, Adrian thought, with grim certainty. They want to make a spectacle of me. He glared up into the stands, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the rows of the cheering crowd, every face blurred into a single image of betrayal and indifference. Thousands of them. People who could stop this madness if they wanted to, but they didn't. They could stop this, his mind whispered, seething with a cold rage. Sheep. That's what they are. I hate them all. They don't deserve their freedom or their enjoyment. Adrian's gaze shifted higher towards the prince's box, where nobles and officials watched with sickening delight. His jaw clenched as the bile of hatred rose in his throat. These were the real monsters, the ones who orchestrated the bloodshed for their amusement, while others bled and died. The world was rotten, and Adrian wanted to tear it all down. Just then, his eyes caught something, someone different. Among the glittering nobles was an elf, seated with the air of someone who did not belong, yet commanded attention. He was the most stern and beautiful man Adrian had ever seen, with hair the color of a wild orchid that cascaded past his shoulders. The elf wore a red cape that draped over his pristine white shirt, and atop his shoulder sat the skull of some beast, giving him an aura of ancient authority. Great, Adrian thought, his rage cooling slightly into disdain. Another higher noble. But there was something more. The elf's presence, it felt different, out of place but undeniably powerful. Their eyes met, and only for a moment. The arena and its noise faded into the background. The elf's gaze narrowed, his piercing eyes locking onto Adrian with an intense, unsettled focus. A flicker of recognition sparked in Adrian's mind. Do I know him? Adrian wondered. But the thought was cut short. A brutal force slammed into his side, a shield smashing into his face. His vision blurred as he hit the sand hard, spitting blood into the dirt. The metallic taste filled his mouth, and the pain shot through his jaw like fire. The gladiator who had struck him stepped forward, readying for another blow, but Adrian was faster. Instinct took over. Adrian rolled to his feet, using the butt of his spear to sweep the man's legs out from under him, knocking him down hard. His sword flashed in a swift arc, striking the next gladiator in the leg before the man could react, and the tip of the blade cut through the flesh and muscle, sending the opponent staggering back, blood spraying across the sand. Without wasting a second, Adrian lunged at the man who had struck him. His spear plunged into his chest with a sickening squish, the point driving through the muscle and bone. The man's body convulsed once more before going limp, and the light of his eyes extinguished, as Adrian yanked his weapon free. No time for breath, no time to think. He spun on his heel, using the fallen man's shield as cover. The other three were already advancing, their shields raised in unison, like a pack of wolves circling their prey. Adrian's calf burned as a sword nicked his leg, but the pain only fueled him further. His movements became sharper, faster. He zeroed in on the wounded gladiator, the one he had slashed moments before. He was the weakest now, the easiest target. Adrian pounced like a wolf hunting a bleeding deer, throwing aside his spear in favor of the dead man's shield. With one fluid motion, he ripped the shield from the body and hurled it towards the remaining two men. The shield spun through the air, forcing them to duck, buying Adrian's precious seconds. He was already behind it, closing the distance before they could recover. He rammed his shoulder into one of the gladiators, sending him off balance, and followed it up with a brutal slash to the back of the man's neck. One more down. Now it's 2 against 1. The odds are still against him. But Adrian thrived in this kind of chaos. His mind moved quickly, calculating each movement, each breath, each drop of blood. The two remaining gladiators hesitated, perhaps realizing they weren't dealing with a normal opponent. Adrian's reputation wasn't just for show. He was a predator in this arena, and they were his prey. The one who had wounded his calf rushed him again, trying to take advantage of the injury, but Adrian anticipated the move. He sidestepped, deflecting the strike with his sword, and then drove his elbow into the man's throat. The gladiator choked, stumbling back, and Adrian finished him off with a quick, decisive stab to the heart. The last one, now alone, faltered. His confidence evaporated in the face of Adrian's relentless assaults. Adrian advanced slowly, his sword glinting in the sun, his face a mask of cold fury. Adrian could hear the crowd roaring, calling for more blood. His gaze drifted up one more time, locking with the elf who had sat motionless, watching him with the same intense stare. "Who are you?" Adrian thought briefly before turning back to the final gladiator. Without a word, Adrian charged, his sword slashing through the air. The crowd roared louder. Adrian's calf throbbed with searing pain as the sword sliced through his leg. He grunted, staggering back a step, his blood staining the sand beneath him. The wound burned with every moment, slowing him down just enough to turn the battle against him. He clenched his jaw, his muscles tightening, as his grip on the spear faltered. The gladiator in front of him, sensing the shift in momentum, pressed forward with a vicious swing. Adrian parried, but his leg, injured, slowed his movements. The blow to his spear hand came fast, a brutal slash across his left arm. His fingers went numb, and the spear clattered to the ground, sending a cold wave of panic through him. His breath came in ragged gasps, as the pain in his arm pulsed like fire, but there was no time to dwell on it. The crowd cheered wildly at this bloodshed, but Adrian's focus was elsewhere. He caught a glimpse of the elf again, seated high in the prince's box. His orchid-colored hair gleamed in the sunlight. The elf still hadn't moved, but his eyes were locking on Adrian, watching him with the same piercing, unreadable expression. Adrian's mind drifted again. Why not focus on this battle? He was good at battle. Who was this elf? Why did he feel so familiar? But his wandering thoughts were interrupted as a second figure joined the elf, sitting beside him, a man, taller and broader, with chiseled features and black hair slicked back. He was dressed in an open suit with a large coat draped over his shoulders, his chest drawn with heavy chains of gold jewels that glistened in the sunlight. The new arrival leaned in close, saying something to the orchid-haired elf, their conversation unreadable from this distance. Focus, damn it! Adrian's momentary distraction cost him. A hard kick slammed into his knee, sending him crashing to the ground. His vision blurred as he hit the sand, dust and sweat mixing with the blood dripping from his calf. The gladiator loomed over him, sword raised high, ready to deliver the final, finishing blow. Adrian rolled to the side just in time, the blade embedding itself into the sand where his head had been. Gritting his teeth, Adrian scrambled back to his feet, his left arm burning and his leg barely able to hold his weight. His sword felt like lead in his hand as he blocked another strike, and then another. The force of each blow rattling through his bones, the crowd roared with each hit, hungry for blood. The gladiator's shield blocked most of Adrian's strikes, their swords clashing violently in a desperate back-and-forth exchange. Adrian could feel his strength fading, his body screaming in protest with every movement. But he couldn't stop. Not now. He had to win. He had to survive. Their blades collided again and again, ringing out like steel thunder. The gladiator pressed forward, driving Adrian back step by step. Each clash sent jolts of sharp pain through Adrian's injured arm, but he held firm, refusing to let the pain break his focus. The gladiator swung wide, aiming for Adrian's shoulder, but Adrian ducked, letting the blade whistle past his ear. In a fluid motion, he drove his sword into the man's exposed side, but the strike glanced off the gladiator's armor. Frustration boiled in Adrian's veins. The gladiator was relentless, his shield a constant wall, his attacks growing faster and more precise. Adrian's chest heaved with exhaustion as he searched for an opening. Their swords met again in a grinding lock, both pushing with all their strength, metal screeching under the strain. Adrian gritted his teeth, forcing the gladiator's sword down toward the sand. The man struggled, but with Adrian's fury, it gave him the edge. With a sudden, savage stomp, Adrian brought his boot down hard on the gladiator's sword, shattering the blade in two. The broken metal clattered uselessly to the ground. The gladiator's eyes widened in shock, his defenses suddenly crumbling. Adrian didn't waste a second. With a brutal efficiency, he thrust his sword upward, driving it straight into the man's mouth. There was a sickening crunch as the blade pierced through the back of bone and flesh, to the point emerging from the back of the man's skull. The gladiator's body jerked violently before going limp, collapsing into a heap at Adrian's feet. The crowd erupted in frenzy of cheers and applause, the blood-choked spectacle having reached its brutal climax. But Adrian didn't hear them. His eyes were once again drawn upward towards the prince's box. The two elves were still watching him. The chiseled black-haired man was smiling now, his eyes gleaming with a predatory interest. Slowly he raised his hands, clapping along with the crowd, his gaze never leaving Adrian's. He mouthed something as their eyes met, the words clear despite the noise in the arena. "I will see you soon." The chill of those words ran through Adrian's veins, more unsettling than the blood and death surrounding him. He stood frozen for a moment, his breath ragged, sweat and blood dripping from his face. The orchid-haired elf remained silent, his expression blank. He gave a single nod, acknowledging Adrian's victory, but there was no smile, no applause, just the same intense gaze that had followed Adrian since the moment he stepped into the arena. Adrian's mind swirled with questions. Who were these elves? Why did they watch him with such interest? But there was no time to think, no time to wonder. The battle was over, and the crowd was still roaring, their cheers like the crashing of waves against the large walls of the arena. He staggered forward, his body screaming in protest. The taste of blood still on his tongue, his eyes flicked one last time towards the prince's box before the guards approached, ready to drag him back into the darkness. But those eyes of the two elves, burned into his memory. As the gate began to close behind him, Adrian knew this would not be the last time their paths would cross. Not by a long shot.